now. Ready to go.
Very good. Well, good evening, everyone, and I am delighted to be here for this live event with Michael Crummey and Emma Donoghue. I will introduce both of them before we have our chat, but I would just like to welcome you all virtually. I'm sorry we can't all be in the same room together, but it does mean that we can do an event with me. I'm Erica Wagner, sitting here in my office in London, and then we have our two authors in various parts of Canada. Michael Crummey is an award-winning writer whose work encompasses poetry, fiction, and memoir. His 3 books of poetry include Arguments with Gravity, winner of the Writers' Alliance of Newfoundland and Labrador Book Award for Poetry, and his first novel, River Thieves, was a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. His second, The Wreckage, was a finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize. His third novel, Galore, won the Commonwealth Writers Prize, and Sweetland, his fourth, was also a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award. But we are here tonight to discuss his most recent novel, The Innocence, which was a finalist for the Giller Prize, the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, and the Governor General's Literary Award. It is a gripping, atmospheric tale, gorgeous and terrifying, said The Economist. And though that piece appeared without a byline, I'll reveal here that I wrote it, also noting that Michael Crummey captures in hypnotic prose the force of the driving sea and the ways of a beautiful, barren place. His protagonists, brother and sister, Ada and Everett, are cast adrift. I can't wait to hear more about it from him tonight. And I'm delighted to be in conversation with Emma Donoghue. The pair, I should note, form a mutual admiration society. Emma Donoghue shot to global fame with her 2010 novel, Room. It was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and in 2015 was adapted by her for a film starring Brie Larson and directed by Lenny Abrahamson. As well as being a novelist, she is a writer of short stories and a scholar of literature. She has been writing full-time since she was a teenager. Her first novel, Stir Fry, a narrative of contemporary Dublin, appeared in 1994, and she swiftly began garnering acclaim and prizes. It was with her third novel, Slammerkin, inspired by an 18th century murder on the Welsh borders, that she moved into historical narrative, a genre in which she has made herself adept. Her new book, The Pull of the Stars, is her 13th novel, and it is a tale set, as it happens, during a global pandemic. It is set in a maternity ward in Dublin in 1918 at the height of the Great Flu, which killed more than 50 million people across the world. Both intimate and political, it is a forthright portrayal of a time which now seems, in many ways, eerily familiar. Writing in The Observer, Alex Peake Tompkinson wrote of Donoghue's ability to capture tenderness and beauty amid the horror of the setting. And if we were all together, of course, I would invite you to give a great big round of applause to these two fantastic novelists, but I know you are doing that where you are sitting. So it really is wonderful to talk to you both, Michael and Emma. I'm so glad you can be here. And I suppose what I'd like to start by doing is asking you each in turn a little bit about the origins of these novels, sort of where these novels started for you, how the ideas came to you, and what sparked them. So Michael, perhaps can I start with you?
Sure. I'm a little uncomfortable going first just because I feel like I'm riding Emma's coattails here, but I'll jump in. So this book is about an orphan brother and sister in an isolated cove on the northern shores of Newfoundland, back around the turn of the 18th century. And the idea for the book came from most of what I write is historical to one degree or another, and I spend quite a bit of time in the archives in St. John's, the provincial archives. And I'm usually in there researching something specific, but whenever I'm in there, I just poke around because it's full of thousands and thousands of fantastic stories. And about 10 years ago, I was in researching a particular subject. And in the course of poking around, I found just like a one paragraph. I don't remember if it was in a newspaper or a journal, but it was a report about a clergyman. And this was at a time in Newfoundland when most communities were too small to have a church. So the clergy would travel from one community to another. And in the course of his travels, this guy happened upon an orphan brother and sister living alone in an isolated cove on the northern shores of Newfoundland. And he quickly sussed out when he met them that the sister was pregnant, and automatically assumed, and I'm sure quite rightly, that the brother was the father of that child. And that was it. There was no other information about how long they had been there alone, what happened to them afterwards. But I knew as soon as I read that there was a story there to be told. That was my first thought. My second thought was, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. I don't want anything to do with that. Thank you very much. Because it's such a, I mean, you know how fraught that story would be, regardless of how you told it, and how many places a writer could mess it up. So I didn't take a note of it. I don't think I could find that again if my life depended upon it. And I proceeded to try and forget them. And yet I was completely unsuccessful. And over the next 8 years, they would just come back to me every now and then. And I was kind of haunted by their circumstances and thought about them in relation to my own life, mostly. Because, I mean, I grew up in a time when there were resources for youngsters. And there was a sex education class in my school. When I was almost 13, my mother forced me to read a book called Almost 13. And then took it further and wanted to know if I had any questions about anything I'd read. Of course, I had no questions. But even with all of those resources, I remember that time as the most confusing and in some ways the most terrifying, and certainly in some ways the loneliest time of my life. Because those changes are so immense and so difficult to make sense of. And I just couldn't imagine what it was like for that brother and sister left alone with no one to turn to but one another.
Difficult in the sense of even if you have the help, as you did.
Yeah. And so when I finally decided to write it, it was because of that. It was, I wanted to try and create a sense of what that might have been like for them to move through those changes and trying to make sense of it completely on their own.
And that we'll come to, there are strong connections there with some of what's covered in The Pull of the Stars. So Emma, tell us a little bit about how you, I think both how you landed on this story, and I think we'd also like to know, it does seem extraordinary to have published a book just now that is about the Great Flu that happened 100 years ago. So tell us a bit about how the novel came to you and perhaps the circumstances of its publication.
This one began with an article in The Economist, which, as you pointed out, they have no bylines. So I can't even get in touch with the journalist and say, thank you so much for that extremely well-written article. Was it you by any chance? No?
I don't think so, but I could find
October 2018, and it was an article about the centenary of the Great Flu. And of course, I'd heard of the Great Flu, but I'd never really paid it any close attention. And what gripped me, it wasn't the fact of so many people dying, it was the atmosphere, the fact that this was a modern world with electricity and trams and machines and rapid transit and a state of global war going on, and this invisible enemy. So that weird mixture of sort of medieval plague and modern society, urban society. And I thought, oh, you could write a novel about the Great Flu where it would feel almost like a post-apocalyptic city-based story rather than a kind of, ancient times. So strangely enough, it was the atmosphere that came first. And so I wrote the novel in 2018 to 2019, sold the novel, and then my publishers said, oh, with the American election coming up, let's put it off till 2021. And I said, fine. So I delivered the last draft in early March this year, and then thought, oh, phew, I get a whole year off. And it honestly hadn't occurred to me that the headlines I was reading about the virus so far away had anything to do with my book. And then my publishers got in touch and said, let's bring it out in July. And I was shocked, and I felt it was a little indecent to be trying to sell anything during a pandemic. But actually, I see their point that The Pull of the Stars makes more sense this year as part of this year's conversation, especially since, without my adding anything to it that was based on COVID, it's got all sorts of echoes, not just about the facts of a pandemic and people wearing masks and so on, but the social factors, the way it's hitting communities that have already been hit hard by poverty and racism, the sort of social determinants of health. The novel turns out to be all about that. And so for me, it was a strange experience to write the novel. And then, in reading the headlines ever since March, I keep going, oh, that bit is so 1918. Politicians are still lying in exactly the same ways as in 1918,
And that sense of, one of the things that's very striking about the novel, throughout the novel, there are the characters read signs telling them how they should behave. And
yes, I invented these government posters, but they're all inspired by the kind of propaganda the governments were putting out worldwide. I remember finding some in Argentina and Brazil, and they often featured rousing rhymes, like coughs and sneezes spread diseases. So I used quite a lot of rhyme. And I tried to bring out the kind of Beckettian absurdity in some of this advice, like the public is advised to stay out of public places. And you're thinking, okay, if they're not public places anymore, what does it mean not to have any public places that the public are allowed to be in? And there'd be a lot of vague reassurance, like, the government has the situation well in hand, but also vague guilt tripping of the individuals catching the illness. They'd say something like, seek out fresh air and sunshine. And I would think, okay, say you're living in the Dublin slums, in dank, stifling, rotting rooms, and you're thinking, where's my Italian villa? Where's that fresh air and sunshine when I need it? So yes, actually, the bit I enjoyed most about the book was coming up with those government posters. And, whenever I would read, say, that Boris Johnson was telling the British to stay alert, I would think, oh, that's exactly like in 1918. How can you stay alert against an invisible enemy?
I do want to talk a bit more about the research for both of these novels. Michael, I was very interested to learn, after I read the book, about what are called Outport Communities. Can you tell us a little bit about those communities in Newfoundland that this brother and sister were part of?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know where the name came from, but an outport is basically a fishing community. And Newfoundland is made up of two solitudes. One is town, which is St. John's, the capital, and everything else in Newfoundland is an outport. And up until the 20th century, it was true that every other community was a fishing community. And it's up until 1992, when there was a moratorium put on cod fishing because of the collapse of the cod. It was still true that 95% or 98 or 99% of all communities were fishing communities. And they were, up until, Newfoundland was not a part of Canada until 1949. And before that point, most of those communities would not have had roads into them. They would have been accessible only by sea. So they were very isolated, usually very small, very close-knit. And they sort of spread out from St. John's in both directions. So St. John's was kind of, the Avalon Peninsula was kind of where Europeans first started settling. And then they started moving further as the best fishing areas were taken up. People started moving further and further. In the case of Ada and Everett's parents, moving further and further north. So, and it would often happen that a family or a small group of people in a community that had established itself and had sort of taken up the best fishing spots, they would decide, okay, we're just going to move further away to look for a place to fish. And that's what happens in the case here. So it's a single family that goes off and is basically living on its own. And the only contact with the outside world is this schooner, the Hope, that comes through twice a year. And it comes through in the spring to provide supplies and then it comes through in the fall to pick up the fish, the salt fish that the family has caught. And so after they lose their parents, that's Ada and Everett are 11 and 9, and they're basically alone in the world, but for that sort of pendulum of that ship arriving twice a year. And not all Newfoundland outports were quite that isolated, of course, but there were many in their time, and so that's that. And outport culture is kind of what all of us think of when we think of Newfoundland culture, like that sense of communities that were incredibly self-reliant, incredibly close-knit, but also incredibly isolated, and in some ways without the basic services you would, that most communities, even at the time, would expect, like no access to education, no access to medical care whatsoever.
And that one of the things that connects these novels, I would say, is their depictions of different kinds of poverty. And one thing that strikes me, Michael, about this, the hope coming twice a year, is that Ada and Everett, they live in almost a kind of indentured servitude. They have no other way of getting their supplies.
Yeah.
They don't have a choice.
Yeah, a lot of people from Ireland and England who came to Newfoundland came first as indentured servants. And once they worked off their indenture, they would then set up their own fishing business. But even in that case, it operated under something called the truck system. And that was where a merchant gave all the supplies on credit with the promise from the people fishing that they would give what they caught to the merchant. But the merchant set the price of the goods that they were given on credit, and then set the price for the fish that they took in the fall. So right up until Confederation with Canada in the late 40s, a lot of Newfoundlanders lived in cashless societies, communities, and a lot of Newfoundlanders lived their entire lives in debt to the merchant. And there were not a lot of options to get out of that. And certainly in the case of Ada and Everett, there are no options. That's all that's available to them.
Emma, in your wonderful novel, there's a kind of remarkable confluence, I would say, of politics. I wonder if that's one of the reasons, because of course, 1918, it was a global pandemic, as we know. You could have set the book anywhere, but you chose to set it in Dublin and in a maternity ward too. So there's the pandemic, there's the Great War, which is still going on. There's Irish independence, and then there's the lives of these women coming together in this ward, finding kind of their own independence and their own lives. How did you decide to navigate sort of all of those politics?
Sure. Well, as you say, the subject was potentially huge. I thought, okay, I should probably go for Ireland because I think I can get an early Irish 20th century voice right. But in a way, the big decision about the book was when I came across this rather obscure fact that I knew that adults in their 20s and 30s were very vulnerable to this flu. That was the weird thing about it, that it tended to kill the young parents, not the older ones. But I came across this little commented on fact, which was that women in late pregnancy and around labor and for 2 weeks after labor were particularly vulnerable to catching this and were particularly likely to have birth complications. And I thought, where did they put them? In all my reading, I have not found any mention of how they managed, because they could hardly put contagious women in a birthing ward or women in labor in a ward of people who had the flu. So I decided there must have been some kind of maternity quarantine ad hoc ward. And I thought, I'll set my novel in that, and I will make it be the equivalent of the trenches for the men. I'll make it this space of terror and death, but also community and camaraderie, and fighting for life and death, one person at a time. Because if you're setting a novel during World War I, you can't ignore the war. but I thought this would be a very interesting kind of, woman-centric equivalent space to writing about the fighting men. So even though the novel deliberately keeps itself very tight, it's just 3 days and it's one small ward. But of course, you sense the war around it. And once I had that hook, I knew that the novel would not, get lost. It wouldn't wander around the world, as it were. For me, I just don't have an epic imagination. I find I can achieve much more intense effects if I shut people up together. So the little fact about maternity patients was the crucial one for me.
Maybe Emma, would you read us a little bit?
Sure. I'm going to read you a tiny bit from the very start. So Nurse Julia Powell is an Irish nurse midwife heading off before sunrise on Halloween in 1918. And I'm just going to read you 2 pages from the very beginning. Still hours of dark to go when I left the house that morning. I cycled through reeking Dublin streets that were slick with rain. My short green cape kept off the worst, but my coat sleeves were soon wet through. A waft of dung and blood as I passed a lane where livestock were waiting. A boy in a man's coat shouted something rude at me. I pedalled faster, past a motor car creeping along to eke out its petrol. I left my cycle in the usual alley and clipped the combination lock onto the back wheel. German manufacture, of course. How would I replace it when its mechanism rusted up? I let down the side tapes of my skirt and took my rain-soaked bag out of the basket. I would have preferred to cycle all the way to the hospital, and it would have brought me there in half the time the tram took, but matron would not hear of her nurses turning up in a sweat. Emerging onto the street, I nearly walked into a disinfection cart. Its sweet, tarry reek marked the air. I walked away from the masked men who were spraying the gutters and feeding their hose through the grating of gully after gully. I passed an improvised war shrine, a wooden triptych draped with the Union Jack. There was a chipped azure Virgin Mary for good measure, and a shelf below overflowing with decaying flowers. The names painted on were just a few dozen Irishmen out of the tens of thousands lost so far, out of the hundreds of thousands who'd enlisted. I thought of my brother Tim, whom I left at home finishing a piece of toast. At the tram stop, the pool of electric light was becoming watery as dawn approached. The lamppost was pasted with advertisements. Depleted and debilitated from living too quickly? Feeling old before one's time? Tomorrow, I would be 30. But I refused to flinch at the number. 30 meant maturity, a certain stature and force, no? And the suffrage even now, they were extending it to women over 30 who met the property qualifications. Though the prospect of ever voting felt unreal to me, since the United Kingdom hadn't had a general election in 8 years and wouldn't till the war was over, and God alone knew what state the world would be in by then. The first 2 trams whizzed by, crammed to bursting. More routes must have been cut this week. When the third came, I made myself push onto it. The steps were slippery with carbolic, and my rubber soles could get no purchase. I clung to the stair rail as the tram swayed through the fading darkness and hauled myself upwards. The riders on the balcony section looked soaked through already, so I ducked in under the roof, where a long sticker said, "Cover up each cough or sneeze, fools and traitors spread disease." I was cooling fast after my bike ride, starting to shiver. 2 men on the knifeboard bench moved a little apart so I could wedge myself between them, bag on my lap. Drizzle slanted in on us all. I'll leave that there, thanks.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was wonderful. Both of these novels are intensely atmospheric novels, set very much in their places, I think. And of course, Michael, you've written a great deal about Newfoundland. Maybe tell us a little bit about why the landscape, what it is. I've never been, I would love to go. What it is about that landscape that continues to make you want to explore it in so many different ways.
Yeah, I feel like the landscape of this place has been one of the main characters in all of the books that I've written. And the reason for that, I think, is partly because the landscape is so spectacular and terrifying. So it's interesting in and of itself for that reason as a writer. But I also feel like because Newfoundlanders were so dependent on the sea for their livelihood, and so dependent on weather. And that the sea was, of course, the source of absolute bounty in some ways, but it was also the destroyer of worlds. You know, it was like a completely unpredictable and merciless presence in people's lives. And I feel like because that was true for so long, that people's Newfoundlanders' relationship to the landscape is really what has shaped people here. It's what has created a distinct character among the people. I mean, and so there's no way to describe what Newfoundlanders are like without describing their relationship to the place that they live in. And so I think that's part of the reason why it occupies so much of my life as a writer. And it's one of those things where I'm always looking for a new way into it, because I'm terrified of just repeating the same old stuff over and over again, which is probably endemic for writers. But with this book in particular, The Innocence, it's the first novel I've written where it feels like the setting is in some ways not as important. At least I feel like the story of the brother and sister is a story that could have happened anywhere. And so I was not so much interested in writing about this is what Newfoundland is and this is how it shapes people. But of course, because it happens in Newfoundland, the place itself becomes absolutely essential to those two youngsters and their sense of who they are and even what their relationship to one another might be.
And it's fascinating to hear you say that, because I would say that for me, the landscape was another character in the book. I mean, I always feel that about your books, but in a very powerful, particular way here. I'm going to ask, I'd love you to read a bit, Michael, and then I also want to make sure that you both have a conversation with each other, of course. But Michael, would you give us a little bit of The Innocence?
Sure. This is from pretty close to the middle of the book. And it's just after, it's as Ada is hitting adolescence, and it's just after a fall storm in which a ship has been wrecked and all of the flotsam has washed up on the beaches, which was terrible for the people on the ship, of course, but was an incredible bonanza for these two youngsters. And it was one of the most exciting times in their lives up to this point. And there's mention of Martha in here, and Martha is their baby sister who had died at the beginning of the novel at the same time as their parents. The first real snow fell before the end of October, and it kept coming in the weeks that followed, the drifting so heavy that even wearing a set of Indian rackets, Everett found it a trial to haul out the trees he'd cut in the spring and left to dry in the woods. They both felt an aimlessness about their days. They had started sharing a bed again, but seemed barely to notice the other's company. Nothing in their young lives had astounded or animated them like the storm and the shipwreck's unexpected windfall and the frantic days of salvaging that followed. The urgency and resolve had drained from their world in the wake of it. Ada felt the lack almost as a physical ailment, an oppressive aching and soreness that for days made her short and careless. She begged off going into the woods with Everett to avoid the irritation of his company. For his part, he was happy to be clear of her peculiar crookedness, and they spent as much of their days apart as the cove allowed. She worried it might be a permanent condition she was suffering until she felt blood trailing along the inside of her thighs as she stood at the fire. She lifted the skirts of her apron and dress, knowing what she would find there, and still shaken when she brought her hand away wet. Piss and corruption, she whispered. A visitor, her mother had called it, in a tone that managed to be diffident and still vaguely ominous. This was after Martha was buried, failing herself then and wanting to pass on what she could to Ada in the time they had left. You'll have a little visitor every month, she said to her daughter. Her eyes sunken, the skin stretched across the bones of her face. Down there, she'd said, and she pointed with her eyes. It'll come calling before long. It was never her mother's custom to offer instruction or commentary or to speak of the future beyond the season ahead, and the strange talk had unsettled Ada. It seemed a symptom of the woman's affliction. What do it mean, she asked. It's just women's business, her mother said, and Ada could hear her mother's voice now as she stood at the hearth, a lick of her own blood on her fingers, and for the last time in her life, she sat to crying over her mother's loss. For the rest of the day, she talked to Martha about the development and how she might deal with the practicalities of the situation. Rags, her mother had said, or deer moss. It seemed a waste of precious material to use cloth, but the moss was all frozen under snow, and Ada turned to the old man's beard they had collected for tinder. She placed the dressing into her underclothes, the tree moss chafing at her thighs until it softened with the flow of blood. She threw each sodden handful into the fire and watched it burn. Women's business, that is, sister, Ada said. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That's just wonderful. I want to remind the members of our audience that there's a little button, as it were, that says ask a question. So you can type in your questions and then I will relay them to Michael and Emma. But I know that you admire each other greatly as writers, and quite right too. And so I wanted to kind of, open up this conversation so I'm not just the interviewer. And I wonder if you had questions you wanted to ask of each other.
Well, before a question, can I just say bless you, Michael, for choosing a period section to read aloud? How rarely, I honestly don't think I've heard another writer, let alone a male writer, writing about periods in the piece they choose to read aloud, and that was exquisite. I love the way she cries for her mother the last time, as if to say, okay, after this day, I have to be the woman,
Yeah.
But because my book is full of childbirth, I found that reviewers are so squeamish about childbirth. I mean, reviewers who could write about carnage in, Bosnia or Gallipoli without turning a hair. They will say of my novel, oh, I have to read it through my spread fingers, the horror of an opening cervix, So I think we're all collectively still very squeamish about women's bits. So thank you so much for contributing one particularly gorgeous examination to the literary canon there.
Thank you so much for that. This is not a question, but when it was arranged for us to talk together, they got me an early copy of your novel. And I don't know if it's the fact that when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but I could not get over how many connections there were between your novel and mine. And in particular, of course, with all of the childbirth that goes on, because my novel opens with a pretty horrific childbirth scene and closes with one. And I don't know, it's something, of course, that I have never even witnessed, but I've always been fascinated by women's stories and by the foreignness of their experience to me. And so I've always been asking about it. It's something that I'm really interested in, and also kind of appalled by, I have to say.
It's a foreign experience too to any woman who hasn't given birth. And then even if you have given birth, you ask another woman her story and it's foreign to yours. That's the weird thing. It's not even like an account of an illness, because it's not an illness. It's something that can go swimmingly, or it can all go horribly wrong, or a mixture of the two, which is why it's such a gift as a narrative device, because you can have this brutally difficult few days and then suddenly all is well for your character and there's a new character in the story, or you can have things appear to go beautifully and then like a fever after it can carry off the mother. So it's a wonderful source of unpredictable narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember as a young man, I spent some time in Central America and had the opportunity to talk to a couple of people who had suffered torture. And I remember when they were telling their stories, I was thinking, God, there's something about this that sounds really familiar. And it took me a while to put it together, but it was the stories women had told me about giving birth that I was hearing. And the one difference, of course, was that there was an end to it in sight, and that the outcome was something that you wanted, right? And that made those two experiences completely different things emotionally, but physically, I just have never been able to get over what a horror show that can be. And your novel is so striking because of the number of ways that things can and do go wrong, but also the ways in which people pull through that. It's pretty astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ireland has been until very recently a relentlessly pro-natalist culture, right? Even my mother from the 50s to the 60s had 8 of us. Now it's just absolutely normal for an Irish Catholic family. And then my grandfather was the youngest of 21. So that kind of pumping out the babies is just a central fact of our culture, even more than the landscape or the weather. Right. So I was interested in setting Dublin's particular pandemic in a setting where these women are like battered by childbirth already. They're coming in already weakened and flat veins and the teeth dropping out of their heads already because of what childbirth has done to them. And there were very particular policies in Irish hospitals to allow for this baby making. For instance, in Irish hospitals, instead of doing cesareans, they would often do this hideous operation where they would unhinge the pelvis, because that allowed the woman to pump out another baby the next year. You know, so this fact really shaped Irish medical practice. So I thought being a midwife in a setting like that, it would be a particularly kind of heroic endeavor to try and save these women, and incidentally the babies as well. But the emphasis was all on saving the women because there was so little they could do for a premature baby that they really just tried to preserve the woman, but not so that she could enjoy her life, very much so that she could have more babies. So it was an extraordinary kind of preoccupation the whole culture had, not just the Catholic Church, but the whole state of Ireland, and even say working class culture in the slums. It was all about proving yourself to be a good woman by producing baby after baby.
Right. What was that, the line about if you really love him, you'll give him how many?
12.
12. Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of a sort of female equivalent of machismo about it. You know, like how many babies I've made.
Yeah.
I've only had 2, so I barely feel like an Irish woman. You know, I've never witnessed childbirth either. I've only done it. It's not the same as seeing it. I'm sure it's quite more gory when you're looking at it. So I really enjoyed trying to get into the head of a midwife, and also not making her anachronistic. I tried to make her true to the time. So, you know, not too many touchy-feely moments. For instance, when you had a stillbirth those days, the midwife was instructed to box it up, put it on a high shelf, and never refer to it again. You know, so there were moments when I was afraid my readers would think Julia was very hard-hearted, but I needed her to be true to the time. And when she bends the rules, for instance, she tells one of the patients her first name when she's asked. That's a big no-no. But in a way, because the hospital is so understaffed and everything's gone so nuts, there's a chance for my characters to act with a bit more individualism than they would if everything was running smoothly, because hospitals were terribly hierarchical and military. So in a way, the pandemic allows me to create an atmosphere which is a bit more, you know, people making human decisions.
Right. And I
find historical fiction, you know, your readers are sort of wanting the characters from way back then to be a bit more like us.
Yeah.
And, you know, we want to create a link there, but not make them just characters of the 2020s, you know, plunked in a period setting.
Right. And, you know, my wife's parents lived in Dublin. Her father trained as a doctor.
Wow.
And their first 3 children were born there, and the first one was a stillbirth. And he's buried in an angel's grave, in the angel grave. And she, Holly's mother, never saw the child. You know, like she had the child and then the child disappeared. So when I was reading that in the novel, you know, it really struck me what that must have been like for Holly's mother.
But another thing that connects both of your books, it's not just these scenes of childbirth, often traumatic, but also your book, of course, Michael, is called The Innocence, but is ignorance. That these are women who are not often well informed about what's going to happen to them. As you just read, you know, Ada has this tiny little briefing from her dying mother, but that's all that she knows.
Right.
And there's a woman, of course, in Emma, in your novel, who thinks that her baby is going to come out of her belly button. And I wonder, you know, there's one of the questions that asks both of you how hard it was perhaps for you to capture this sense of innocence, ignorance, when we perhaps feel so far from that today.
I suppose all you can do is really immerse yourself in sources of the time. You know, I would have read a lot of, say, oral histories of the Dublin slums. So sometimes I would find an anecdote that happened to be from 1960. And then I would just extrapolate from that. I'd be like, oh my God, if she thought the baby might come out her belly button in 1960, then it's highly plausible. A lot of them would have thought that back in 1918. You know, if the prudishness of the culture was such that mothers weren't telling their daughters anything more than some vague phrase like women's business, which is just a kind of a loop, isn't it? It's like saying there's a women-y thing and I'm not going to tell you what it is. You know? So I read a lot of, say, memoirs by nurses about the flu, accounts of training of nurses and midwives. I read hospital books by doctors, you know, telling midwives and nurses what to do and what not to do. And often they would very sternly say, we're just giving you this medical data so that you can call the doctor in time. You're not to actually use any of this information. Speaking of the dangers of knowledge, you know. So yes, I think almost all my work in writing a novel is trying to get into the mindset of the times. In a way, the clothes and so on to me are an extra. It's getting their mindset that matters.
It's interesting you mentioned that the anecdote from the 60s, that one of the books that I read, and I read it years ago, but this had always stuck with me. It was a biography of an American doctor who came to Newfoundland just after the turn of the 20th century and ended up spending his entire life working there, up around Twillingate, which is where my mom is from. And there was an incident where a woman came to see him and she was pregnant. And she knew she was pregnant. She was married and had other children. And she said to him, I was out picking berries in the fall and I got my feet wet. And that's when my period stopped. So this is a married woman who's had children and she has no idea the connection between sex and pregnancy. And so I thought, well, if that's happening in the 1920s, 1930s in Newfoundland, imagine what it was like at the turn of the 18th century. So the kind of information given to Ada and Everett before they lose their parents, even that is not very useful to them in many circumstances. So it was a bit of a challenge it wasn't a challenge to imagine how innocent they were of the world around them. It was a challenge. The real challenge as a writer, of course, is to make how they deal with that innocence feel believable to a reader, and to make that feel like that they're making decisions and acting in ways that even if a reader thinks I wouldn't have done that, they would think it's possible for someone in those circumstances to make those kinds of decisions, you know. And the thing I was really hoping to do with the book was to make a distinction actually between innocence and ignorance, because ignorance is thought of as stupidity often, and these are not stupid people at all. And if the fact that they're able to survive here says an awful lot. And I saw them kind of as prototypical Newfoundlanders, you know, like the fact that they were able to not just survive here, but to make a life of some sort says an awful lot about their ingenuity and their intelligence. But just how much they do not know and have no way of finding out. Like they don't have Google to turn to. But that's a different thing again. The innocence is different from ignorance, you know, and that was a real distinction I was hoping to make in the book. And I do want to say that when I came upon Bridie Sweeney, I was like, okay, so Ada made it to the 20th century. Like it just felt like that could be Ada in a different time, you know, because Bridie's brought up in a way that makes her completely innocent of the world around her. But
yeah, Bridie Sweeney, who's she's a completely untrained volunteer sent in by the nuns to help Julia run the ward, and she's the only character I've ever based on a government report. In that I wanted her to come in with nothing, just, you know, tabula rasa. She knows nothing at all, and so she will learn everything with the reader at top speed, and we'll see her, you know, developing in leaps and bounds, and not just learning information but feeling useful. And then I thought, okay, what background should she come from that will make her so absolutely grateful for this hideous unpaid job, really, that's been foisted upon her? And then I thought about Irish residential institutions, which, you know, the country has gone through such a sort of breastbeating over them, because they're places of horror, very similar to the way in Canada we've been working out a history for the residential schools, but in Canada it was used very specifically genocidally against Native people. In Ireland it was just used against our own, but the poor, basically the working class. So many of our population were locked up in various you know, reform schools or industrial schools, so-called, or orphanages, often where the parents were perfectly well alive, and mother and baby homes where you'd have to kind of work off the cost of your stay by staying on for 2 years and working for the nuns. Magdalene hospitals, where so-called fallen girls, or girls who might potentially be fallen in the future, were sent. So I basically read the Irish government's detailed report on the horrors of these institutions, and I looked not for the horrors but for the tiny little vivid details of people surviving in there. And often the bits that moved me most were accounts where somebody would say something like, you know, the nuns told me I was useless, that I should just be grateful for the food because I was no use to anyone. And the irony is that they were doing so much work. They were praying industrially, for instance. People would pay the nuns to have the children recite elaborate long prayers for them. And they were, you know, embroidering tapestries. They were doing farm labor. So Bridie, in a way, is plucked from tiny little details in a government report, you know. But I have a question for you, Michael, about the issue of knowledge, right? So after reading your book, I have this vivid impression that you know these things, these survival skills in your bones, and that if we dropped you in an isolated cove, you would, like, fashion your own knife out of your shoe, you know, and survive the winter. And all my knowledge is theoretical. I've never had a job since I was a chambermaid and I got sacked. I was no good at it. So I'm just curious. I'm sort of hoping that you have at least some of these skills yourself, or are you all theoretical knowledge like the rest of us writers?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't last 2 nights in the woods. And so I would say it's not all theoretical. Like, I've grown up around it, but I was always a bookish child and a lazy person. And there's a lot of work for survival out there. So most of what I know about that way of living has, again, come from reading journals, reading the Dictionary of Newfoundland English, which has, like, when it gives examples of how people speak these words or phrases, it is full of the most amazing details about how they managed to survive here. So a lot of it is, it's just like you say, picking out those little moments that will give a reader a sense of, well, I always use this example, and I wish I could remember the writer's name, but it was a mystery writer who was being asked by an interviewer, how do you know so much about so many arcane things? And he said, well, if I'm writing a scene where someone's picking a lock, I don't have to know how to pick a lock. I have to know enough about picking a lock to make a reader think I know how to pick a lock. And I think that's a lot of what I end up doing in these stories. You know, that's my dog, sorry. I'm going to these original sources and looking for those little moments that I can steal. Like, there was an account of someone who got snow blindness that I found, and I thought that, like, his description of it was so compelling. That's the reason Everett gets snow blindness in this book, is because I wanted to include those details in there. And of course, I have no experience of it myself, but I'm quite happy to steal from other people to make it seem.
That's a great example. I think people often think that we make up our story and then we go, as if we're going to the store to buy the paint pots to paint the walls, what we've already decided, But of course, often we don't know which bits we're going to include until we come across the amazing colors. I've so often in my research, I'm trying to find some factual matter, like I think with my novel Slammerkin set in the 18th century, I just wanted to find out when you paid. Did you buy your ticket beforehand, like for the Greyhound nowadays, or did you pay at the end? And I found that you paid at the end. And then I was thinking, what if she somehow makes the money during the journey? So often details produce plot rather than just being neatly filled in,
Absolutely, yeah. And when I had finished the first draft of this novel, I just sat down and started reading the Dictionary of Newfoundland English. And because I knew that I would come across words and phrases that I wanted to include, but there were also all kinds of just little moments that you can throw into a scene to make it feel like you are in it and that how these people live their lives,
And it was fascinating to me because it can be sometimes the smallest things. I was saying to someone about your novel the other day, Michael, that I was struck by the word tilt for their house.
Right.
That's what their house is called. And to me, it's such a simple word, but it holds a vision of what this place must be like.
Right. And the word tilt was often used for like a camp, or like trappers would have a tilt on their line.
It sounds precarious.
Yes, but for those earliest times, like that was all they had, right? There was nothing really approaching what we or they even would call a house. But I did love some of the language in The Pull of the Stars as well, because of course the Irish had a huge influence on this place. And I saw the word bockety a couple of times. And I've only actually heard it here in Newfoundland within the last 3 or 4 years. I was interviewing Zita Cobb up in Fogo Island. And Fogo Island is an island off the north coast of Newfoundland. And she says that she grew up in the 18th century, 19th century. She grew up in the 60s. But she was saying that in terms of education, that was only used, she said, if a youngster was too bockety to be any use in a boat, then you had no choice but to give him an education so he could do something. So I love seeing it in your book and knowing where it came from. Although I spelled it differently, but I mean,
I quite often find myself going on Twitter to ask Irish people how exactly you spell some word that I only know orally. I have a vague memory of my mother using it.
Right.
I channel my mother a lot when I'm writing Ireland, which is another lovely way to keep her alive.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I think that of my father as well. That so much of him comes through in these books, and that's a nice way to keep company with them.
I will say we have a comment at the side, which I like very much. Someone has said that they're having such a nice time. Can you both come to dinner? So maybe when all of our isolation is ended, we can all do this. We have a question from our audience, which has been sent in, which is about this year. What have there been any particular challenges? I mean, here we are on Zoom, launching a book in the middle of 2020.
Well, my position has been such an unusual one in that I was rushed forward rather than delayed. I think most writers' experience has been either the frustration of having their book put off or the unhappiness of seeing it come out and get no attention. So, I do think this book got way more reviews because it has a pandemic theme. So I felt a little mortified at getting such a lot of attention for it, But I've been glad to have the opportunity to go on and on about how great nurses and doctors are and so forth, and how, how unfair it is that pandemics are not remotely equalizing. They just hit hard those who we've decided to keep down in the first place, But my experience has been pretty good, especially online events. I was a bit squeamish about them at first, but you do reach more people, and people can access you from far away and isolated and rural parts of the world who couldn't come to the big events. And also I haven't had to go away on book tour and, desert my partner in the busiest point of her term when I usually do. So it's been quite nice in that way. I like just getting to live my life and then pop into the other room and turn on Zoom. So it's quite a good way to kind of fit publicity into your life. I do find book tours rather unnatural. The flying to a different city every day. It can all feel like a big waste of somebody's money and carbon credits. So yeah, there's something to be said for doing it by Zoom.
And how about, of course, this book came out last year, Michael, in America and Canada.
That's right. Yeah, but just coming out now in England and in Germany and in Poland. And
hey,
so
I'm so glad you didn't have to miss your prize ceremonies, because all the prizes you were nominated for. I'm so sad for anyone nominated for things this year, because home in your ball gown is just not the same, is it?
No, it's true. It's true. Those were nice events, and I'm glad I didn't miss them. But I was supposed to be in Poland right now, and so I would have loved to have done that. But honestly, I'm a fairly insular person, and the public side of it, I can do it, but it's unnatural and it's a lot of work for me. And my joke is that, of course, I've been training for the pandemic for years now, because I spend all of my time at home with my family for the most part. So my life has not changed really very much, certainly compared to most people's. And I'm these online things, I have to admit, I'm with you, Emma. I've gotten used to them. People seem to engage with them more than I thought that they would, and the conversations seem to work just as well as the in-person ones for the most part. So.
And there is looking at dinner. That's what I miss. Organizers usually take you out for a gorgeous meal. I mean, there's no equivalent of that if it's me who has to quickly boil up the pasta beforehand for my ungrateful teenagers.
But although the other, as you were saying, Michael, I think there is a kind of interesting thing. If we all get to see each other's sitting room, offices, there is a kind of intimacy to these events that I didn't expect when I started doing them. That I've
like your dog, Michael, very attractive dog there.
Right.
My cat is not a willing participant.
There he is.
Oh, look at that! See, there's the happiness.
He was a main character in the novel before this one, and he got killed off, and people were very upset with me. So I do try to show pictures of him whenever I can to show that he's fine.
Happy ending where the dog is concerned.
My 13-year-old says, "Why do you always have to put in a murder or something disgusting, a rape, death in childbirth? What is it with you?" And I can't explain why adults like these terrible things to happen in our books.
Right.
Drama, conflict. That's how we do it.
Right. I think a 13-year-old, their life feels full of conflict already. They don't feel that anyone has to actually die, But adults are less sensitive, so maybe we just need more to happen to shock us awake,
Well, we are, alas, coming to the end of our time. As Audrey at the side has said, I wish I could have you both to dinner, certainly. This has been just the most wonderful event to talk to both of you, to talk to you again, Emma, and to meet you even virtually, Michael. To all of our audience, I thank you and I commend to you The Innocence and The Pull of the Stars. If you haven't bought them already, you should. And I hope you all thank you very much for the promo work, Emma. Very good. Very good.
Down on the job here somehow.
And all the people who know your names, we're coming for dinner tomorrow.
Exactly. That's right. All right. Well, listen, thank you both so much. I'm going to say goodnight. And I hope you all meet in person at some point.
Bye-bye all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.